and welcome to Conversations with Hannah. Today I am joined with Selectman Beth Casavant, and you and I actually started our day together.
Yes, we did.
At the Shrewsbury Youth and Family Services annual breakfast meeting, and we got to see, you actually gave a beautiful
Thank you.
speech saying why Ellen Dolan was going to be receiving the Harry S. Cutting Jr. Award.
Well-deserved award.
So well-deserved. She's so humble. Tried to basically say in her speech that really it was, everybody else is like sharing in it. It's like,
You set her straight.
yeah, it's like, no, Ellen, it's for you. You have done a remarkable job. And a lot of what we remarked on was, Ellen is a librarian that was highly sought after and could have gone anywhere. And, she came to Shrewsbury, and even despite the library being defeated the first time, just put her head down and got back to work. That was a really remarkable way that she dealt with the adversity. And if you look at the library now and what an amazing community center it is, and how much work is going on there, and just how welcoming and open the library is, it's such a credit to her.
It certainly is. And every time I walk in there, I just think back to all the hard work that went into making that library a reality. And she just kept on showing us and demonstrating why libraries are still relevant when she could have just hid in her office or taken a position someplace else, but she just stuck with us. And
she's really good. She's done a great job advocating too at the state level. She comes every year, and you came in the past on the library days and talks about and makes sure that legislators understand the critical nature of some of the state funding and how that works. And then being on finance committee and you seeing that as well. She always does such a great job when they come in and talk about what is necessary in order to keep the library moving. And she's been such a good steward of also, how to be creative with fewer resources in the past. She
certainly is.
She will definitely be a loss losing her, but we're so blessed to have had her for as long as we have and going into her retirement. So
she set us up well, I think, too, for a transition to another library director.
And that's part of the work that you really do as a leader, is making sure that it's not just dependent on you, that there is a team in place there in transitions. And we've had good transitions in this town.
We have.
Kevin Mitzigar is doing a great job in his second, I think, 2.5 years now as town manager. And you're coming to the end of your first 3-year term.
Yes.
And you've done a great job.
Thank you. Kevin and I actually came in at the same time, which I think was really nice. It's tough to come into a board that's been established, and the town manager had been there for 20 years. So I think that really helped me a lot. And I'm looking forward to running again this May and hoping to be able to work with Kevin again for another 3 years. We have a lot to do, and it's just an exciting time, I think, to be part of the team.
It is, and you've done a great job. I really want to commend you, especially around all the communication issues. I think you've really helped advance the notion of using whatever platforms are available to communicate what's going on in town. And I know that you are, I give you a hard time a lot about how responsive you are on Facebook, but I give you a ton of credit for the work that you've done to make sure that the good work of the board and of the town employees is understood. And sometimes we are going to have challenges, and making sure that people are aware of them and what the plan is really important. So
people just like to know what's going on.
Absolutely.
Talk to them where they are.
I've had transition in my office. Jessica Bellevue, who you were very close with as well, who had been with me almost 3 years. Amazing young woman from Westboro. Landed a wonderful new job at Mass Development as Deputy Director of Communications. It was really hard for both of us to see her go. She was a fantastic member of the office. Everyone that I would run into in Shrewsbury and Westboro would always have some story about how they called the office and Jessica helped with something. And half the time I wasn't even aware of it because she took care of it before it even needed to get to me. But I was wonderful to have her for as long as I did. But the State House, the legislative aides, we don't pay them very much, unfortunately. And so usually if you have someone young who's talented, you get a year, maybe 2 maximum. So
you were really lucky.
I was lucky to have Jessica for 3. And I'm very excited about where she's at now, which is also someplace that I worked at one point in my career. So it's good to see her there. And I've been excited to welcome Anna Darrow to my office. And Anna just graduated from Trinity College in May. And she had interned in the Connecticut State House and interned in the Massachusetts State House this summer. So she's been there since the end of October. She's doing a great job. It's a lot of information, just learning new faces and everything. And she was out here. We had the Thanksgiving luncheon and the Christmas luncheon.
I was able to meet her.
And it was good because then she could start to put faces to names. And so that was really helpful.
And even that is overwhelming to have to come right into a luncheon where you're meeting so many people. And and 2 new communities also to keep track of, not just one. And
right.
So
and not having been from Massachusetts originally either, so you're also learning more about Massachusetts. You're learning about the communities.
Yes, and coming from Connecticut myself, it's a completely different form of government. The way we have a town meeting and a town manager, like you just don't hear about those things in Connecticut. So she certainly does have something to learn, but I also think that she's up to the task. She seems to be great.
She's very excited, very enthusiastic. She actually is originally from Vermont, and her family owns a 100-year-old apple farm up there. And so that was really exciting for her because one of the things that we did this year in the legislature, almost a year ago now, we started the First in the Nation Food System Caucus. So she is primarily also the staffer who coordinates a lot of that work on that side too. And so she was really excited to be able to take some of her own knowledge and family's experience in terms of the agricultural side and understand how the food system works here in Massachusetts. So I was excited to have somebody who is equally as passionate about those issues as well. So
nice fit.
It is a nice fit.
You've been very fortunate to have extremely talented legislative aides, definitely.
I have been really lucky. Actually, 3 of them we were together in October, so we got a picture of 3. I was missing Shar Bozella, my first one, who's now working in New York. But at some point, we'll have to get them all together.
A reunion.
Absolutely.
So are we ready to jump into the tough questions?
Yeah, the tough questions. What have you been doing for us lately questions?
Well, I don't think that anyone's doubting what you've been doing. I definitely want to start out by just congratulating you on a couple of awards that you've received, one in public health and one for your work on regional transportation. And I'm just hoping maybe you can just tell me a little bit more and the folks at home about what these 2 awards were for and what the work was that you did.
Yeah, thank you. I was really honored to receive both of them. In particular, the one on public health, the Massachusetts Association for Public Health awarded me with their Leadership Award, and it was due in part to the work. There had been a special commission on local and regional public health, and actually Kevin Mitzigar was on the commission too. He sat on behalf of the Mass Municipal Association as their representative on this commission, and it took a look at how do we provide public health services more efficient and more effectively across the Commonwealth. There isn't some pot of money that comes from the state specifically to cities and towns for public health, and so it comes out of largely your local property tax dollars. And because it is something that is a lot of times less visible as to opposed to something like police, fire, education, which many people understand and can actually see. Public health sometimes isn't as well funded in cities and towns. And so we were looking at, is there a way to better organize so that cities and towns aren't paying all the same costs, which could be spread across more than one municipality. We, as a member of the Central Mass Regional Health Alliance, have done that. So we are a member with Worcester and 6 of the other surrounding towns. And so the model that we are a part of was one of the models that this commission ended up recommending other cities and towns to look towards. And that's sort of, in some ways, a cafeteria model. So some cities and towns may want certain services and not need other ones. But they don't have to replicate and pay for some of the baseline costs in every city and town when you can aggregate it and you can get more services out of it. So it was about a 2-year commission that Kevin and I were on. It was really fascinating. We did a lot of really good work and have come up with recommendations. And I also filed some legislation along with my colleague, Representative Denise Garlick, that would set up new training mechanisms, because one of the challenges too in local public health is there really isn't a dedicated stream of people coming into public health on the local level. So a lot of times you might have people apply for jobs who have some background that's helpful, but they're also missing a certain amount of skills that would be helpful in the job. And so we're looking at how do we provide opportunities to train people who come into these roles, and also a career path so people can see this as something that they're wanting to do. And one of the things in municipal government overall is a challenge finding people out there who are looking to go into municipal government. And this is really no different, but it was a specific look at that. So I really appreciated the opportunity to work on that, and I was really grateful for the award. And then the regional transportation, regional transit authorities actually came out of a question of the state has been putting more money into it, but in some ways we've had lower ridership on some of the regional transit authorities across.
These are the blue buses that we see.
So we see the ones from the Worcester Regional Transit Authority is the one that serves Shrewsbury and Westboro. And so part of it was looking at, why, if there's increased money going into something, are we seeing less ridership, and really exploring some of the issues that are there. Certainly public transportation is critical. And, there are people who, especially who live in cities and towns or sometimes more remote areas, that either have no access to any other public transportation or don't have a car. And so public transportation is their only way of getting around. And so we were exploring some of those issues and trying to come to some agreement in terms of what are some of the criteria which the state can look to, that RTAs are really doing the work that they need to do to help increase ridership in exchange for increased funding. So I was very pleased to be awarded that, along with my two other colleagues who sat on the commission with me from the legislature, Senator Harriet Chandler and Representative Sarah Peake from the Cape. So, but again, it was, for me, who spent part of my career doing consulting, the opportunity to work on these commissions and really deep dive into an issue and think about how do we make sure we're doing these different things as efficiently and as effectively as possible, I really enjoy. I get a lot out of that. And so I'm always telling the minority leader that if there are different opportunities to do things like that, then I am more than happy to be part of them. And he did just ask me and appoint me the other day to a commission on youth homelessness, looking at that. It's been an ongoing commission, but to take a seat on that. And so I'm looking forward to becoming more invested in that issue and figuring out what we can do.
And when you're looking at youth homelessness, are you also looking at like the college age population? Because that seems to also be something that I'm hearing more about.
It is. And actually about a year and a half ago, you're now a trustee at Framingham State University.
Which is where I'm hearing, especially like during the summer and during breaks, right, that students are having trouble with housing at those times.
And that's one of the things that we've looked at. And we actually had an announcement there about a year and a half ago around trying to partner with some of the state universities who have residence halls that may be able to help house students when there's transition times, like when you have no home to go home to, when dorms close and things, if you are
exactly.
a student. And so they've been part of looking at that issue and have been really thoughtful in terms of how to partner and how to make sure that these children are not falling through the gaps. One of the things that I learned about a couple of years ago, actually at a breakfast at Framingham State, was in Massachusetts, foster kids have the ability to go to the state school system for free after they graduate from high school. And yet we have a very abysmal rate of students doing that. The young people who are foster kids, I think it was only like 10% were taking advantage of it. And that bothered me immensely. And part of what we looked into is it's one thing to pay, for the tuition and room and board, but especially as a mother right now with a daughter in college and one on the way, there's a whole host of other costs that can be prohibitive if you have no support system. So whether it's, requiring a technology, whether it's an iPad or a computer or any of the other, paying for your books, paying for different things that are those indirect costs that aren't typically covered, and then not having a support system who's helping you decide that this is a really important next step. And in many cases, not having had seen parents or guardians or others in their life who took that same path, so they don't see the necessary
just the process
value
of even applying.
Right.
If you don't have someone that has gone to college and gone through the process,
Absolutely.
makes it that much more difficult. It's just another barrier.
Well, in doing, all the tests, taking your SATs and how do you go around and even decide what campus you're going to go to? So there's just a lot of barriers there. And so trying to look at how do we make sure that we're cognizant of those barriers and that we're finding ways to help alleviate some of that hardship. But it's been, it'll be an exciting opportunity to dive into an issue. And Mary Lou Sutters, who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services, is a really, really bright woman who also had suffered from some of these issues when she was a young person. So she's an incredibly credible leader to be leading this issue.
Very interesting. So you had a perfect voting record, 142 consecutive roll calls. That is impressive. I appreciate someone who can be consistent in that way. I think showing up is usually half the battle. What were some of the major pieces of legislation that you voted on that were passed by the legislature and that are now signed into law by the governor or on their way to being signed?
So one of the largest ones, and one that people probably heard a lot about, was the Student Opportunity Act, which was the largest education reform we've had since 1993.
Right.
This is one that we have talked a lot about in Shrewsbury, spent a lot of time talking to the school committee members as well as briefing the selectmen when we've been in, Senator Moore and I, to talk about it. One of the biggest pieces is there was a foundation budget review commission that concluded their work in 2015, and they had come up with several recommendations regarding how to change the formula to better account for spending in education these days. Again, the formula originally was put into place in 1993, but there have been several things that have happened and that weren't fully accounted for. And so, what was happening was cities and towns were having to pay an inordinate, share of these newer costs, and we weren't capturing them well at the state level. So one of them was on employee healthcare cost. Another one was on English language learners. Low income students was another particular challenge, as well as special education costs and how we were capturing those. So the Budget Review Commission came up with several recommendations that needed legislative approval. And it took several sessions for bills to be filed. The House and the Senate in the last session both passed bills and negotiated down to the wire the last day of our formal session in 2018, but they couldn't come to consensus. Right. So again, in 2019, at the beginning of this legislative session, several competing education bills were filed. I was a co-sponsor of one in the House that was filed by one of my colleagues. There was also a bill that was filed in the Senate. And both the House and the Senate passed legislation, and then again it went to conference committee, which is essentially where they iron out details. So you have 3 members from the House and 3 members from the Senate. You have 2 members of the majority party, so the Democrats, and 1 member of the minority party, the Republicans. Negotiating for us on the House was not only the education chair, Alice Peisch, but the minority ranking member on education, which is Representative Kim Ferguson, who I've had on this show before and who you know well. Yes. Really smart woman who's done so much work on education. And so they were able to come to an agreement with the Senate, and we did vote the bill this fall, and the governor signed it into law. And so as part of that, there was a recognition that even though as a state, we still continue to lead the nation, and in fact, when you look at us in the worldwide view, I think at one point we were, 9th in the world or something. In
Massachusetts.
Yes,
always at the top.
And so, but the disparity between the kids who were doing well and the kids who weren't was growing. So even though we remained number 1, when you look down into the data, you recognize that it wasn't the same experience for every single student in Massachusetts. And part of what that was a resourcing issue. As you know, local property taxpayers pay a significant portion of education dollars in the community as well. And in some communities, there aren't those dollars to put towards education. And so part of what this education reform bill looked at was looking in some of the cities and towns and recognizing that a lot of what their cost drivers were things that really hadn't been proportionally taken care of in terms of the way that the formula is set up. And so it increased funding for them in certain areas, which will help them enormously. It added in some additional accountability measures. So again, if you're going to get increased funding, you need to have a plan to make sure that this funding we're going to see increased movement in terms of a positive response for these students. So you can't stay down here and have that disparity grow. We got to start closing those gaps. And so it gave the commissioner of the Department of Education some tools in order to do that. And then one of the things that it did, and this is where it really impacts Shrewsbury in 2 ways. One, it put a minimum amount per student each school district would get per student each year. So in each budget. In the past, it's sort of been the governor will file one thing, the House will file something else, the Senate might say something else, and then it gets negotiated down.
So now we would know going in.
Well, now we know there's at least a minimum. So $30 per student is the minimum. So in Shrewsbury, when you look at us having 6,000 plus or minus kids, that's about $180,000 that you're going to get.
Right.
And then it could, if there are years when for whatever reason we have enough funds that we can do more, then you can do that. But at least we know, and this is critical for us, like in Shrewsbury, typically when our budget comes out, the town manager is making a guess, because at that point there's been no real work into the state budget to know with certainty what numbers are going to come to you.
Right.
Now at least the town manager and the superintendent of schools will know, okay, we know at least this is the baseline. Like this we're certain of at this early point. And so the House doesn't take up the budget until April and the Senate till May. We don't negotiate till June, and then we don't vote it until July.
Right, and we've already had our town meeting. So
In May.
Yeah,
Right.
Exactly. That's
So-
always the trouble.
So that'll give more certainty. The other piece is in special education, in the past, transportation was not reimbursed by the state for part of that.
Right.
And that has now been added in. So when the governor files his budget, which is going to happen next week, 2 weeks actually, we have the State of the State on January 21st. His budget will be filed the next day. He has told us in caucus meetings that they are fully funding all the commitments that by passing this law this year. So we should have a good idea then in Shrewsbury what our increased number will be for special education that will get covered that wouldn't have been in the past. So I'm looking forward to seeing that number.
Right.
But it was, as we worked through this process of dealing with this bill, there was a lot of times where I was on the phone with Joe Sawyer and Patrick Collins a couple times a day, just making sure I was understanding how different versions of things would impact us here in Shrewsbury, and same in Westboro with Amberbach, and making sure that nothing that was going to be proposed would in any way hurt us financially. I think Joe Sawyer said it really well in one of the school committee meetings. We understand that there are districts that have challenges, and we want their financial challenges to be met. They need more investment. That's clear. We just don't want to do it sort of off the backs of our school districts. We want to be held harmless from that and hopefully also gain something. And so I think at the end of the day, all parties were satisfied that it should be about $1.5 billion investment that occurs, will not harm anyone. It's certainly going to lead to some additional investment, greater degree in some school districts than others, but at the end of the day, Shrewsbury will see a net positive from this development. So I was very pleased about that.
And did I also see that there's an additional, $800 million for school building assistance projects?
Yeah, so the cap was increased on that, which allows, again, one of the challenges has been because of the age of our school buildings here, and being one of the oldest, colonies that existed. There's so much more that's older here, and with construction costs increasing, we were lucky when we did Sherwood. That was actually at the depth of the recession, and so we were able to get an amazing price when we did Sherwood, and actually saved even more than we thought we would in the end because of efficiencies. But right now, there's a certain number of larger construction companies that bid on this type of work, and there's also so much other work that's out there that it is raising the cost of building schools. And so we've been fortunate to some degree with the school building that we're doing right now, of figuring out ways again to help eliminate some of the costs or drive down some of the costs that otherwise would be an issue. And we've been blessed to work with really great partners who are also really conscientious of the dollars that we have and how we can spend them. But across the state, there's so much of a need that we needed to provide more assistance and more availability for those funds. So
I think there's communities, it's not like here where we have one building to do at a time. I think there are communities where multiple school buildings are way beyond what we were seeing with Beale.
Yeah, and we actually just got the email the other day as legislators from the school building authority saying that their next round is currently open, and they're taking in the statements of interest and things. I thought, oh, good, we don't have to worry about this year.
No.
Like, we're off the hook for a bit. So, but no, that the education and the other bill, again, which really has ties to us locally, and you were part of this last year. I think last February or March, I had written a letter to the Board of Health asking them to consider taking up a restriction on flavored tobacco products, and I was really grateful for your support on that. SYFS was wonderful on it. The schools were great. We all kind of said, you know what, with what's going on with vaping in our kids in our schools right now, like, we need to do something, and we need to start locally. And actually across the Commonwealth, I've seen many instances where local action really drives state action. And generally not as quickly as this action occurred. I was really pleased at this progress, but the town of Shrewsbury, our Board of Health was terrific. They took up this issue, and they did vote to put an adult restriction, meaning you could only sell it in an adult-only establishment. It did not include mint, menthol, and wintergreen.
Which it does now.
Well, in Shrewsbury it didn't, and that was really a challenge. And one of the reasons that the Board of Health was wanted to see where it was going is because there was an ongoing suit by one of the convenience stores in other cities and towns who had included the menthol and wintergreen.
Right.
And so the Board of Health was like, let's put in this level of restriction now and let's see watch where this litigation goes, and then perhaps we can do that next. But at the same time, I had been a co-sponsor of the legislation at the state level to ban flavored tobacco products. And my colleague, who I share Westboro with, one of them, Representative Danielle Gregoire, whose main area is out of Marlboro, had filed this and been a real leader on it. And we did take that up this fall. And part of it, again, was because there was a high level of awareness because of what was going on relative to not understanding what was causing these horrible deaths.
4 of them there.
4 of them here in the Commonwealth, and many, I think 40 now, I think, across the country. And it was unclear what was driving that, except the common denominator was some vaping. Like they weren't sure if it was nicotine, tobacco, if there was something in it, if it was THC products. They've now, I think, narrowed down to the vitamin E being one of the real issues. But we voted the flavored tobacco ban here in the Commonwealth. I spoke on the floor in support of it. I feel very passionately about this. I'm very excited, and I actually took my daughter Caitlin in with me to when the governor signed it. Caitlin is on the Student Wellness Advisory Committee at Shrewsbury High School and has been a member of SCAPE and really, seen what this has done to her fellow students. And so for me, it was important to share the power of how if you act locally and you do something and you really advocate and you educate, and unfortunately because of how much of an epidemic it has become, it really, I think, accelerated where I think we probably would have gotten at the end of the day, but not as soon as we did. So I was really happy to see that. And again, grateful that Shrewsbury took a leadership position on that and addressed the issue here locally. And then we were then able to put the ban in. The other thing that we did is we included an excise tax on e-cigarette and vaping products, which did not exist on there. So unlike tobacco, which does have an excise.
Significant tax also.
Yeah, it's 75%. So they're equal now.
Yes.
And that's important because you need some revenue in order to deal with some of these prevention and education issues that occur. And so we were hindered by that on the state level as well. So now that's a level playing field. And somehow I don't understand how we've already come to the end of our time together.
But there's still pages here to talk about.
So we will have to do this again very soon.
Part 2.
But I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very excited to see what happens in your next 3 years as selectman, and happy to support you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much, and thank you for your work also. This is a great opportunity.
Excellent. Good to start my day and end my day with you.
Exactly.